Okay, let's dig into our drum tracks. Now, LV1 Classic comes with 16 plugins built in. So there's the Emo suite of plugins, which is a high-pass, low-pass filter, a 4-band parametric EQ, and the D5 Dynamics plugin, which is actually 5 plugins in one. There's a gate, a compressor, a de-esser, a limiter, and a leveler. So I'm using mostly those plugins, and then I'm supplementing with a couple of other things that I have licenses for, which you can do as well. So any of the 160 plus other plugins in Waves bundles and as Waves individual plugins can be used in LV1 Classic. So if you have more licenses for other plugins, great, you can, they'll all work within this software. So let's just play the drums for a second and we'll dig into some of the processing. One thing about this section of the song, and really from this part out of the whole rest of the song, the drummer is really going for it. I mean, he's hitting hard. And our microphone choices really impact how we're going to approach this mix. We have DPA 2011s for overheads, AKG 414s on the toms and the snare bottom. Those mics are high-end condenser mics, and so they're going to pick up a lot of everything around them because they're designed to do that. I mean, it's a beautiful microphone, but there's a bunch of top end and a bunch of just bleed that we're going to get from all the drums into those mics. So on the snare top, we have a Heil mic. It's the PR20. As I said, the snare bottom is a 414. And then in the kick, we have a Beta 91 by Shure inside the drum. And then the out mic is an Audix D6. So we've got a great mic package. We've got a great drummer who's playing really loud. The challenge is, how can we find some clarity and some isolation in those channels to make our drums really have some punch and some impact? Okay, so let's start with our kick mics. Now, one thing to be aware of is we have 2 mics. One's inside the drum and one's on the hole of the outside of the drum. And so the sound of the beater head hitting the drum is reaching those mics at different points in time. So we need to be aware of any potential polarity issues that may happen in terms of timing. Now, there are certain ways to mitigate that if you do have a problem. One is just to flip the polarity button, but that doesn't really fix the timing. It just basically inverts the polarity of the microphone or the signal. Another is to delay the kick in mic to the distance of the kick out mic so that essentially the signal is hitting those more in time. But in this case, I'm not even sure if I have to do either of those things. So let's just check and see what our kicks sound like. So there's my kick in, my kick out. So if I flip the polarity button, there's definitely a change. But for me, in terms of the low frequency response and just the sound of those 2 mics together, I kind of like it left alone. So again, just a thing to be aware of, a thing to check. But let's talk about processing for a minute. So you can see on my kick in, I have the Emo Q4 parametric EQ. So I'm boosting some like 80 hertz, cutting some mid-range, boosting some top end. And so for me, that's kind of my standard approach to kick drum. I'm going to start by taking out some of that 300 to 500 hertz, depending on the drum itself. There's that boxiness that tends to build up in that frequency range. I'll dump some of that and then, build the low and the high to taste. So let's listen to just this drum. I mean, that sounds like a 91 to me, so I'm pretty pleased with that. Now, in terms of the dynamics, you can see I have my gate engaged because, like I said before, there's a lot going on when this player gets going on this kit. So let me take out the gate so you can hear the rest of what this mic is hearing. So I'm really trying to get rid of some of that tom bleed because he's riding the floor tom a lot in this song. So I'm using a gate to just kind of try to mitigate some of that, but I still want it to feel pretty natural. So let's see what the gate does. Put the two kicks together. Great. Now, one other thing I'm doing on the kick out mic, because I want to get some low information out of that microphone, out of that track, I have our bass that I've inserted at the end of the plug-in chain. Our bass comes with LV1 Classic, and it's a great way just to intensify the low frequency information in the signal. So sometimes I'll use it on bass guitar, sometimes I'll use it on a kick drum to really kind of bring out some of that low frequency body. So as you can see, I have the frequency set to about 65 hertz, and we just kind of play with the intensity to get the kind of result we're going for. So let me turn the intensity all the way down and just get a feel for what it feels like when we bring it in. Let me solo that mic and we'll check it out. So you can hear how much more body is in the low end of that D6 once we kind of bring in some of that intensity. So that's something that you can just kind of play with. It's definitely, you know, season to taste kind of thing, but in this case, I like it. So let's move on. Let's listen to our snare top. So you can see that I'm using a different plugin here. So on my snare top, I removed the filter and the parametric EQ that comes with the standard channel strip and replaced it with this SSL EV2 plugin. And so this is basically Wave's emulation of an SSL console channel strip. We have some mic pre-information here at the top, our compressor settings, gate, filters, and EQ. And so I want to play the snare drum for a minute so you can see what I'm doing. I'm basically boosting some top end, some high mid, cutting some of that 400, cutting some low mid like 180 to 200, just because there's a lot of that in the drum itself. So let's listen to what we've got. Good, so you can hear some of that tom bleed in the background, and as we get going throughout the song, there's going to be even more cymbal bleed and stuff. So I want to use the gate in this plugin to help mitigate some of that. And so we have our range and threshold settings right here. I'm going to, in our release. So I'm going to engage the gate, and now let's listen again. So we're really just capturing those backbeats at this point. Let me mess with the range and threshold settings to see how it changes as you move these knobs. So it's a really flexible way to get as much or as little of those other drum sounds in your snare top mic as you feel fit. So I think I'm pretty comfortable with that. Let's listen to kick and snare now together. Great, so you can hear now from my snare bottom mic. Let's look at what I'm doing there. I've got some EQ here, and I don't have a gate on the snare bottom. So any of those ghost notes and any of that sort of snare sound is going to come into my overall sound because I'm not treating the bottom mic the same way I'm treating the snare. As I said, that snare bottom is a AKG 414. So if I add some top end to that, the sparkle that's already in the mic is going to actually pick up more of that. And so I'm really focusing on getting the sound of the snares themselves so that when I blend that with the top mic, it's a good kind of full-bodied snare drum sound that's not just crack and not just woody, but it's actually snary as well. Let's move on to toms because I think these are another good opportunity to talk about just bleed and gates and all that kind of thing. I want to listen to the toms first without the gates so you can hear all that's going on in those microphones. And let's see if we can make a clearer picture of what those toms actually sound like. What's interesting to me is how much snare drum is in those toms. We've got all the cymbals, of course, but then that snare is just cracking through all those mics. So in my Emo D5 gate plugin here, I've got a really high threshold. This is tom 1, that's tom 2, and that's tom 3. And you can see how high the threshold is in those plugins to really try to only capture the sound of the drum. So let's listen again now with the gates in and see how it's different. Okay, so we've still got a lot of hi-hat coming into those tom mics. So let's listen to each one and see how we might make an adjustment to make them even better. This is tom 1, and it's opening on the occasional snare hit, but honestly, that's not going to bother me too much because it's not getting all the cymbals. How about tom 2? Okay, it's opening when the tom hits, which is good. But there's just a lot of other stuff going on, so it's going to be really hard to get that completely isolated because I do want it to feel natural. So that's the battle. It's like finding that balance between too open and then so closed that it's not even going to let the sound of the drum through. So I think we're okay with that for now. Let's check tom 3 and just make sure. Yeah, you can see on this, my open threshold is really high. So it's only going to grab that, the stick sound of the tom. So again, finding the balance of when it's going to open and when it stays closed is really a challenge with this song because there's so much other, information trying to get into these microphones. So let's see how that works in context with everything else. So that gives us a pretty good picture of the individual drums. Let's introduce the overheads and just see how that impacts the overall sound. As you can see here, I'm using a filter. So I've got the overheads high pass to about 170 Hertz. I'm using the Emo D5 plugin, but just for a little compression. And then I have EQ that's just cutting a little bit of that sort of sizzly upper mid. Let's listen to our overheads in this context. I always love it when we can hear the drummer yelling into the overheads. That's always a good feeling. He's excited to be here for sure. Let's take a look though at this plugin. So we have another option here. This is the API 2500 compressor. Now, I really like the sound of compressed overheads. And so the D5 is obviously a great plugin and it's doing its job, but I want to see if we switch, we'll turn the D5 off and switch to this API, if it gives us any more of that sort of sloshy kind of really compressed sounding overhead. Again, it's a matter of taste. I personally kind of like that pumping kind of sound. Let's hear it with the rest of our drums and see how it impacts the sound of the overall kit. In a way, it kind of brings back some of the things that we're trying to gate out of the tom mics. And so I think having that bigger, fuller picture of what the kit sounds like as a whole is kind of what this approach to overheads is giving me, which I feel pretty good about. I do want to go back to the filter though, because I want to listen to these overheads without the high pass filter, just so you can hear everything else that's getting into those mics. There's a lot more kick, there's more PA bleed. It's important to be aware of where your high pass is going to be on these overheads. I don't want it to be another kick mic. I don't want it to be a PA mic for sure. So let's talk about group processing. So for me, you may have heard me talk about this before. I usually approach drums with two groups. I have all of my drums going to a drum dry group, so there's no processing going on in this group. And then my drum smash, I have all of the skin drums, the kicks, the snares, the toms, going to a compressor that's doing a lot of work. So let's take a look at this drum smash. I'm using the Kramer Pi compressor for this. You could use onboard compression with the D5 compressor, or you could use any number of compressor plugins that you like. But this just happens to be my personal preference. I've used this for a long time and I like the way it sounds. So here's the sound of just that compression. So again, it's pumping pretty hard. You can see on the screen it's doing 10 dB of gain reduction mostly the whole time. It's a preset called Super Smash Close Room. And so it's this sound of a drum room that's really getting squashed pretty hard. If we combine that with our drum dry sound and put our reverb back in, that's kind of the sound of our drums. Let me bring the smash in and out so you can hear the difference. Again, I think having both together gives it a little more thickness, a little more girth, a little more impact. I think, mixing this way has always been fun for me, and I like having the smash on its own fader so that if it's, in various parts of the song, if the relative relationship between the dry and the smash needs to change, I just have it on a fader and I can adjust accordingly. So if it's a soft ballad, I may not need the drum smash at all. If it's a big song like this, I'm for sure going to have it up, and it might win over the dry group. You never know. But because they're on a fader and they're side by side, it's easy for me to just reach up and control the drum sound as a whole just with these two factors. So let me talk about routing a little bit. So I told you how I route into my groups, but then those groups are going to a drum DCA. So I'm controlling the level of my drums overall through a DCA that's not controlling individual inputs, it's controlling the groups. That way, any processing that's going on in that group isn't affected by the level of the DCA. If I was controlling my inputs with the DCA, every time I pulled that down, then there'd be less level going into those groups, and group processing then would be affected. So I'm, for sure for drums, I'm using the drum DCA to control the groups rather than the individual inputs. Next, I want to talk about our drum verb. This song is a big anthem, sounds massive when the whole band is in. So I want my drum verb to kind of match that feel. So we have some options. LV1 Classic comes with True Verb and R Verb, which are two really good Waves reverb plugins. But you can also use any other reverb plugins that you own. So let's start by looking at the drum verb channel and see if we can come up with some things that work. So one thing that I like to do is I like to have the filter plugin first, so I can put a high pass, low pass on my reverb, so I can control the sound that's getting into the verb itself. You may also use a parametric EQ if you wanted to fully EQ kind of the verb before you get the return. But either way, this is what I'm doing. I just have a simple high pass, low pass, and I'm using True Verb right now. And so because this is a big sounding kind of anthem, like I said, I'm using kind of a concert hall type preset that I've tweaked a little bit. So, you know, you can control the room size and the dimensions and the distance, and, you know, basically that room size is what's going to help you kind of put the reverb in a space. So let's listen a little bit and just see what this verb sounds like. So I'm sending signal from my snare, snare bottom, and toms to the reverb. So I'll open it up pretty extreme so you can hear it, and I'll bring it back to where it sounds kind of reasonable. So my goal is for the reverb to sound like it's in a similar space that my vocal is going to be in terms of reverb. I probably won't use the same reverb for my drums that I do for my vocals, but it's that kind of thing. Let's listen to the R verb just to see how that's different. Again, you have built-in parameters like EQ and room size and decay time and all those things that you can manipulate. Now, thirdly, let's check out what H-Verb has to offer. So H-Reverb is a plugin that I have a license for, and so I just want to see how this might be different. I have the ambience preset here, 3.5 second reverb time. Let's just see what that does. So the point is, you have a lot of different choices for reverbs, and in all the reverbs, the preset menu can really be your friend to find a starting point for what you might want to use for your verb. You know, there's all kinds of factory presets, and then submenus with halls, chambers, rooms, plates, and then there's a large sort of collection of kind of presets that other engineers have used. In other words, you might like Stephen Bailey's arena reverb that he might use on a Passion event or something like that. So again, drum reverb is great. My biggest tip is to kind of let the space that the drums are in mimic what you need for the song so that it fits the song well, it fits the sound of the rest of the band. So I hope this has been helpful as we talk about drums and kind of the foundation of our mix. So let's move on and add our bass guitar to the process.